All right. Hello again, adventurers, and welcome to another exciting episode of the D&D Deep Dive, the show where we dive deep into classes, subclasses, and other features of 5th edition Dungeons and Dragons to help you get the most out of your choices. So, today, we are going to be continuing along the path of the Artificer. And you probably have already realized this, but look! Another new person! This is Joe Louie. Joe, why don't you introduce yourself?
Hi, I'm Joe Louie, Logic, Lawjick on all the socials. I am a parent. I am an old school D&D extra lifer, progenitor of the player class Dan, and amateur snake handler.
Amateur snake handler. That sounds like a story in itself.
No, the snakes are just bad at being snakes.
Gotcha. Makes sense. Again, I have brought some really awesome, amazing people in to make me look better. And we're going to be talking about the Artificer, specifically about homebrewing things for the Artificer. And just kind of things that can inspire you to make cool new things. In the first video, we talked about the Artificer itself is a little bit newer as far as classes are concerned in D&D. Whereas something like the Fighter has existed since original D&D, Artificer didn't really show up until Eberron. Which Eberron was actually cool little side fact if you're unaware. Eberron was the campaign setting from a contest that Wizards of the Coast ran, where they were trying to get their next big campaign setting, and if I remember correctly, I believe if I'm completely talking out of my ass, feel free to let me know in the comments. If I remember correctly, there was a contest, and the Eberron pitch was the one that was chosen. So this is literally a fan-made campaign setting that was turned into an official campaign setting, which is super cool. And the Artificer exemplifies Eberron. It really does. Eberron is this kind of steampunk combined with high fantasy. Everything is kind of dialed up to 11. The adventures are just a little bit bigger. You know, the wildlife is a little bit stranger. Everything about Eberron is just really fun. And the Artificer is that. They are a magic user that doesn't, bother with boring things like, learning spells and writing them down in their cool little notebook. No, the Artificer makes really cool stuff that blows up and then infuses it with magic so it blows up cooler. That's what we're going to talk about today. Joe, your kind of a opinion of the Artificer and maybe your kind of background with Artificer.
Well, I try to live the Artificer life. I did a lot of steampunk, and I tinker with all sorts of things. If it doesn't have Bluetooth, I put Bluetooth in it. If it is 100 years old, let's go ahead and make it wireless or wired if it makes more sense. I live in the Mystery Shack, and I love making things that shouldn't be.
Which, if there was a better description for a real-life Artificer, I don't think I could come up with it. So, we have an actual Artificer, guys. Before we get into everything, quick reminder, if you do enjoy this stuff, please like the video, subscribe to the channel, hit the bell icon, turn notifications on. All those things are super important. As we learned when William SRD was on, likes literally translate to additional views. For him, I think he said it was somewhere between like 6 or 10 additional views for every like he got. So if you want other people, if you think this is an underrated series, which I have I would never say something like that, but other people have said this is a very underrated series. Hit the like button. More people will see it. Quick refresher on 5th edition class design. In 5th edition D&D, every class is designed to play very, very differently right from the beginning. In order to do that, they have these things that we call defining features. A defining feature is either something unique to the class, or maybe it's not unique, but they can use it earlier or they can use it differently than any other class. And in order for something to be a defining feature, it needs to show up within the first 2 levels. So for the Artificer, as a reminder of the defining features, the Artificer gets 3 class features within the first 2 levels. They are Magical Tinkering, Spellcasting, and Infuse Item. Magical Tinkering is a little more kind of role-playing style thing. You basically can infuse tiny non-magical objects and let them do kind of cool things. You can make them glow. You can basically turn them into a little speaker and make them emit a recorded message. You can make them continuously emit your choice of an odor or a non-verbal sound. Or you can draw on them effectively. So as much...
Like draw on them or draw on them?
Well, a static visual effect appears on one of the object's surfaces. This effect could be a picture, up to 25 words of text, lines and shapes, or a mixture of these elements as you like. You literally can just, you can make anything into a whiteboard. And the best thing about this defining feature is this is the Artificer in a nutshell. The Artificer is going to look at mundane objects and see them in ways that other classes can't. Other classes don't. And Magical Tinkering, as much as there isn't as many kind of combat uses for it, though I will say the ability to make an object emit an odor can be very useful in combat, depending on the odor you pick. But there's so much about Magical Tinkering that just really will help you get into the mindset of your Artificer. And I think that's one of the best things about a defining feature like this is that it forces you to think in a different way. And just by that fact alone, the class is going to play differently because you're going to think differently. And it's one of the things I like about the Artificer, because there's already a lot of half-casters in D&D for 5th edition, and there's quite a few subclasses that will add magic to your class as well. So creating another partial caster could have been a kind of really boring thing where it really doesn't do anything unique, and just with this one little defining feature, we now have this very unique class. The second defining feature is their spellcasting, and I've mentioned before in other Viva videos, spellcasting has to be a defining feature for a full spellcaster because most of their turns, their action will be casting some sort of spell. The Artificer is a half-caster. So the spellcasting may or may not be a, quote, defining feature, but it needs to interact in some way. And the interesting thing about the Artificer is specifically how they cast their spells. Mechanically, their spells work like everyone else's. If you want to ignore all the flavor text, you can. It's not really the greatest thing for the Artificer to ignore it, because the Artificer is flavor. But mechanically, it's a half-caster, and it casts spells like a half-caster. But when you look at the actual flavor that's built into it, you have spellcasting focuses that no other class can use. Your spellcasting focuses can be thieves' tools. They can be artisan tools. And because of that, the way you cast spells is very differently. If you use an alchemy kit to cast your spells, well, then maybe you don't cast spells, you create potions that you throw at people. I have a player in one of my games, their artisan tools that they use for their Artificer is a calligraphy kit. They basically draw kind of like talismans. If you've ever seen certain Japanese anime and things like that, it's actually a big part of Japanese folklore is calligraphy has power behind it, and certain symbols can be inscribed onto pieces of paper and things like that, and they can ward off...
Too.
No, Chinese too, yeah. They can ward off evil spells, or ward off evil spirits and the things like that. And so that's kind of what she does. Is her magic is in writing, and so she inscribes runes onto her weapons to infuse them. Or when she creates spells, she prepares her spells in the morning. She goes and she draws little pictures and things like that, and then just presses them to people to cast cure wounds or things like that. So spell casting for the Artificer is by far the most unique spell casting in 5th edition, because instead of just kind of changing how it works or changing the spell list, they have different spell casting focuses. They cast their spells differently. You are encouraged to flavor your spells in ways that no other caster does, and that turns the Artificer into something really, really cool. Another thing that's kind of unique is, for a half caster at least, Artificers do get cantrips. A lot of half casters, like the Ranger and the Paladin, do not get access to cantrips. They're weapon based classes, and so when they're not casting spells, they are intended to be using their weapons. The Artificer can actually go both ways, depending on the subclass that you choose. We talked about the Battlesmith in the last video, which is more of a weapon-based Artificer, and then the Alchemist can go very, very differently, and the Artillerist gets real crazy. So yeah, it does give you quite a bit of versatility depending on how you want to build your Artificer. You can make them very much more kind of melee weapon focused, or you can make them much more kind of spellcasters. Even being half casters, they can lean much harder into the spellcasting aspect of it. And that is a kind of unique thing for a half caster. You don't generally have that choice. Half casters generally have to have some weapon aspects built into the class in order to do it. The final defining feature, and this is the defining feature that has, since the introduction of the Artificer, I believe in 3rd edition is when Eberron came out. Cool. I'm glad someone knows more than I do.
Like, what did the cover of the book look like? Yeah, it was one of those.
Is infuse item. Artificers are and this leans into why they're such a great representation of Eberron. Artificers make magic items. They are intrinsically connected to magic items, forging them, using them, creating weird versions of them. I know in Eberron, guns and things like that, depending on which flavor of Eberron you're going with, guns in there are a little bit more commonplace than they're going to be in something like the Forgotten Realms, and they are intrinsically linked to Artificers because of that tinkering nature. The other thing that tends to be really common with Artificers is crossbows as well, and weird things like repeating crossbows and other magic-infused stuff. They're a really cool class. Infuse item is the 5th edition version of it, and it's really cool. I could do an entire video about the different infusions you can pick, because there's a list of infusions that you have that all do kind of interesting things. Things like Returning Weapon is one of my favorite because I love thrown weapons, and Returning Weapon allows you to do the Thor thing, throw your hammer and it comes back to you. But then they also have the ability to replicate certain magic items, and that opens up a massive amount of customizability built into your Artificer. Because, and I've mentioned this before, 5th edition, both 3rd edition and 4th edition, magic items were not just interesting, magic items were required. You could not get to higher levels in either one of those editions without having magic items. The monsters would be too difficult. In 4th edition, they actually had separate rules if you wanted to not play with magic items. They had an entirely different rule set to make it so you could. And the rules for creating higher level characters in 4th edition, you actually, if you created a character beyond level 1, when you created them, you would give them 3 magic items. All magic items in 4th edition had a level, and you would give them 1 magic item that was 1 level higher than the character, 1 that was the same level, and 1 that was a lower level. And then you would also have enough gold to be able to buy another magic item that I believe was at your level. because all magic items had like a value. So yes, magic items were such an integral part of previous editions that in 5th edition they went, you know what? We don't want your class to be limited based on what magic items you can get. You know, if your DM isn't handing out magic items, we don't want you to be limited. So in 5th edition, magic items are designed to be more rare. We have the attunement system. You can only attune to 3 magic items total, unless you're an artificer. And magic items themselves are meant to be more rare. They specifically say in the Dungeon Master's Guide, having maybe in your setting, you can go to any store and, you know, go to the toy store and pick out your favorite wand. But in your kind of standard 5th edition world, like the Forgotten Realms, at this point, after the Second Sundering and everything like that, magic items are very rare. The Spell Plague did a number to magic in general. And now finding magic items is a very rare thing. Your class should be able to carry you, and you can play from level 1 to level 20 without ever using a magic item in 5th edition. It's not quite as much fun, but it is possible. The classes are designed to work without magic items. So having a class that is built around using magic items is a very, very different thing for the game. And it did kind of show Wizards kind of stepping back a little bit from their very kind of hard stance at the beginning of 5th edition of, no, magic items should feel very, very special, to, okay, magic items can be a little bit more mundane and a little more commonplace, and the Artificer is that. So, yes. I've been talking a lot. Joe, opinions on just the stuff that I talked about here. I know you're not quite as from the conversation we had before we went live, or before we started recording. You're not quite as familiar with 5th edition as I am, because I do this far too much. But from hearing all that, and your own, you know, you have some experience with it, your opinions on the kind of defining features.
It seems like it's potentially game breaking, given the stance of magic items to be of importance, and it makes the character that does that stand out. And it just occurred to me that I'm playing in an Eberron game, and none of us are artificers. Nope, there is one. They don't make it as often, and they're not as broken as they should be.
Well, and I think I really like the 5th edition version of the Artificer because exactly what you're saying. It should be broken in 5th edition, and the limitations that they put on the infuse item were really, really well designed. And when you are doing homebrewing, which is what this whole series is about, when you are homebrewing, learning how to put proper limitations on things is essential. And I think the infuse item is a really great example of how you can limit that. Things like, if you take an infusion, you can only use that infusion on one item. So, like, you can only take the returning weapon infusion once. You can't dual wield throwing hammers, because you can only learn that infusion once, and you can only infuse one item. So those little limitations built into infusions, which is something, one of the easiest ways to homebrew Artificer things is to just come up with new infusions. And understand when you're homebrewing for the Artificer, putting those limitations, understanding that your limitations are going to make them more fun to use, not less. Because if you create something really, really powerful, you actually take choice away from the player. Because instead of being able to use all of the class features that they have, you've just created one that's always going to be the right answer. Good game design gives a player choices that have pluses and minuses. Bad game design gives a player a right answer to every situation. And so that you bring up such a really good point about the Artificer. The Artificer is defined by its limitations. And I think that's what makes it so much fun to play. Because, and I've said this before, I tend to prefer class-based RPGs versus classless or skill-based RPGs, simply because the limitations, I think, inspire more creativity. I liken it back to, because I'm a music geek, what people consider classical music is technically separated into generally into three periods of music. You had the Baroque period, you had the classical period, and you had the Romantic period. And this is how creativity tends to work, because you'll see the same thing in art, in music, and in just about everything. The Baroque period is where they start creating the rules. That's what the Baroque period is about. Bach was a Baroque composer. They create the rules and they follow them to a T. The classical period is all about, okay, we have these rules, we're not going to write any more rules, but we're going to stay within the rules, but we're going to be as weird as we can while we're in the rules. Mozart was a perfect example of he never broke any of the rules, but he always did weird stuff. If you ever watch the movie Amadeus, one of my favorite scenes in it is they're critiquing, and it's not a super historically accurate movie, but it's a really brilliant movie. But they're critiquing Mozart. And one of the things that they said about one of his pieces that I used to know the name of and I can't anymore was, well, there's just too many notes. The human ear can only hear so many notes. You have to take some of those notes out. And he goes, there aren't too many notes. There's exactly as many notes as I need to say what I want to say in this piece of music. How could there be too many notes? And that was a defining feature of Mozart. It's one of the ways that we learned to identify Mozart's music. I took a class in high school where we had to do, they called it drop the needle tests. We'd literally take a record and he would drop the needle randomly and we had to identify the piece of music. And one of the ways we identified Mozart was too many notes. He was always playing around with melody and counter melody and counterpoints, and he was just flooding all of his work with all of these crazy ideas and all these different things all working together and all meshing together. And that's the kind of creativity that limitations provide. And a lot of people think that doesn't make sense because it's like, well, limitations mean you can't be as creative. No, they encourage creativity.
Right.
So yeah, when you're homebrewing for the Artificer, embrace the limitations. Put limitations in and then be excited when people find unique ways to work inside these limitations, because it will create the most entertaining experiences you've ever had when you go, oh my gosh, I never thought to use this that way, but it totally works. Any other thoughts? That I cut you off completely?
No, I just the idea that the limitations are what make something more interesting. So I've been, since we talked about being on the show, I've been looking at examples of artificers in pulp culture, like Batman. Batman, I would say, is an artificer. His limitation is he doesn't kill, so everything that he does has to be bound by the violent but non-lethal. And I think, even if it's just one simple rule like that you are bound by, makes the creativity much better.
Definitely. And I love bringing in pop culture and just things that we're very familiar with and translating them into things that should be very obvious. Obviously, Batman is an artificer. But if you had asked me before you said that, well, what class would you make Batman? I probably would have hum and hawed a little. Oh, is he a paladin? Because he has kind of a coat. Maybe it's like, but as soon as you say it, no, that makes perfect sense. And I had the same thing happen when we were doing the fighter episode. Don Diego mentioned that the Arcane Archer subclass is the Hawkeye subclass. Yeah. And I had never thought about it, but I'm like, oh my God, it's trick arrows and it's Hawkeye.
Yeah.
And it was so blatantly obvious. So yeah, I love that. Good transition that you had no idea. The two big comic book companies are DC and Marvel. And one of the things that a lot of people like to do is kind of compare Marvel's version versus DC's version of the same kind of archetype. And the first subclass or the only subclass left that exists for the Artificer that I want to talk about is basically Marvel's version of a character like Batman, which is Iron Man. When you think about it, their backstory is a little bit different, but the kind of idea of, you know, playboy, lots of money, goes into crime fighting in secret, they're effectively what would happen if the same motivations were put into two very, very different situations. Because Iron Man lives in, I think he's in New York.
Yep.
So Iron Man's in New York, which is a kind of corrupt city, but Gotham, which is partially inspired by New York,
Chicago.
and partially inspired by Chicago. And the modern versions of it are much, much heavily more inspired by Chicago than the New York aspect of it.
Because I think New York is also Metropolis.
I went into a deep dive of this once because that was my thought, was that Gotham is Chicago and Metropolis is New York. And what I found out is Metropolis is actually based on West Coast kind of LA style city.
Wait, isn't that Edge City?
Well, and that's the weird thing. None of the things, because New York partially inspired Metropolis, but it also was inspired by a couple of things. And the same thing was true as Gotham. Gotham was meant to be kind of a combination of New York and Chicago. The other thing is when Gotham was first created, New York was a much different city than it is now, and Chicago was not, without getting too political here, the corruption in Chicago was not quite as widely known as it is now, where it is very, very well known that there is a ton of corruption, and Chicago fits the idea of, if we wanted a real Gotham City, it would be Chicago. There is such a perfect example of, you know, income inequality and corruption and, you know, philanthropy going wrong and everything in there that kind of plagues Gotham City. That is what Chicago is today. And when we're going back to, I think it was like the 40s and 50s when Detective Comics was first introducing, that was New York. New York has changed so vastly since the 40s and 50s. But anyway, kind of going back, and the Armorer subclass for the Artificer. As I mentioned before in these videos, your features of your subclass need to somehow interact with the defining features somehow. They don't all have to somehow be directly related, but if you ignore the defining features, if you ignore the base class, you create an underpowered subclass. Specifically because, and we've seen this in things like the Spike Barbarian. I can't remember what he's called right now. The Battle Rager Barbarian, which doesn't really interact with a lot of the defining features of the Barbarian really well. It gives him this new armor, and Barbarians specifically have unarmored defense. It clashes with a defining feature of the Barbarian. And so when you're looking at a subclass, you want to make sure that you're taking into account that, yes, the base class exists, and the base class, the reason people play it, are going to be these defining features. So they should show up. The first thing that shows up in the Armorer is Tools of the Trade. This is a super, super common thing. Happens all the time in subclasses. They give you additional proficiencies. This one, proficiency in heavy armor. Really? An armor that has proficiency in heavy armor? Who would have thought? And then you also get proficiency with Smith's tools. So this Tools of the Trade actually interacts with both the kind of tinkering and the magic, the spellcasting feature, because it has effectively given you a new focus. Your Smith's tools can be your spellcasting focus. And if you already have this tool proficiency, you can gain proficiency with another type of artisan tools of your choice, which is the common thing in basically everything post Tasha's. If they give you proficiency in something, they'll generally always have this little thing of, by the way, if you already have this proficiency, because you don't pick this until 3rd level, we're not going to punish you for what your choices that you made at 1st level. You'll get something else. The second thing that you get for the Armorer is Armor Spells. It's expanded spell list. This particular flavor of expanded spell list is you always have these spells prepared, and they don't count against the number of artificer spells you can prepare. Another thing about the Artificer, they are a prepare caster, meaning in the morning they have access to their entire spell list, and they pick and choose the ones they think will be most useful on this day, compared to something like the Sorcerer, where they learn spells when they level up, and those are the spells that they know. So armor effectively just gives you extra spells you always have, or armor spells gives you extra spells you always have available to you, and then you also have your artificer spells that you choose every morning effectively.
Is there a mechanism that makes it so that you can choose them in the moment, like a feat?
There is a feat that was introduced in I know there's one in the New Exandria book. I have it right here. What's it called again? Tal'Dorei Reborn. They have a feat that does that. I can't remember off the top of my head. Someone in the comments will be able to tell us in a second. Let us know in the comments below. I know the idea of that exists, where you can kind of change. It might have been something in one of the newer books that they introduced.
Because something like Ocean's 11, where you have that momentary flashback of preparing and like having a spell slot open so that you can be like, oh wait, I did prepare for this exact situation, and being able.
I know wizards, if I remember correctly, wizards technically, as long as they have their spell book with them, if they take a short rest, if they didn't prepare something, they can, or I might be making this up, I'm not sure. The idea exists. I don't know if it's officially been published by Wizards, or if it's just something in one of the Critical Role books, but I know that idea exists as a feat. Because I remember covering it in one of my deep dives and talking about this could be a very clutch thing. The ability to just change a spell in a certain situation is there. As much as it doesn't sound very useful from 100 feet away, as soon as you start thinking a little bit more tactically, it means when you're preparing your spells in the morning, you don't have to try and predict what's going to happen later in the day. You pick the ones that you like, and you know that if you do get into a situation where, crap, I knew I should have prepared Lesser Restoration today. Wait a minute, I did. Things like that are really, really useful. So, good question. Like I said, I know it exists somewhere. I cannot tell you if it's officially published by Wizards or if it's a Critical Role thing, but I've covered it in D&D Deep Dive. I remember that.
Okay.
So,
because that seems like that is an absolutely clutch thing of like being always prepared.
Mm-hmm.
It's like
going
through, it's like the bat shark repellent.
Yeah. Well, and again, that's that would fit extremely well in the idea of an artificer. Artificers are kind of in the moment. Oh, I can do that. The kind of check off. I can do that. I can do that. I can. They just come up with an idea. Oh, I could do that. So if you wanted to create an artificer subclass, and one of your defining features is you have this flexible spell preparation thing. Again, you need to build in limitations to it, because that could become very, very broken very quickly. But if you build a subclass around that idea of flexibility, that could be a really interesting subclass to play around with, especially, and this is something that I tend to prefer when I look at a subclass, is you introduce, at third level or whatever level you pick it, you introduce kind of the defining feature of the subclass, and then as you go up, you expand upon it. As you level up, you give, every time you do this, there's an additional bonus to it, or you can use it in a different way. So it incentivizes people as they go in levels to stick with this, as opposed to multi-classing into this as something else, and rewards people for sticking with this as a subclass. So something like that could very easily turn into the two. At third level, you can just prepare a spell you didn't have. You can switch out a spell once per long rest or something like that.
Or like having Jarvis reload something.
Yeah, something real simple like that. And then when you get to 6th level, the next time you get it, now when you do that, You can also change damage types of the spell, or when you do that, you can give someone else a shield or something. Like maybe depending on the school of the spell that you put in, it does something different. Like there's a lot of different ways you can go with that. Where every time you level up, you can just add more aspects to it. Okay, well now you can, you can help someone else prepare a spell maybe instead of doing it yourself. Again, and the entire idea behind good game design is you want to give players choices. You don't want to give them right answers. So those limitations are going to be the difference between a right answer and a choice. So really cool idea though of an artificer. I don't know what we would call the specialty is what they call their subclass. I don't know what we'd call that specialty, but it sounds like a fun class to play.
Yeah.
Finally, and this is one of the weird things about the armorer is you technically get 4 different features at 3rd level. And generally, one of the things that I mentioned when you're building a subclass, you generally at 3rd level only want to give probably 2 things. Something maybe non-combat focused or maybe some additional proficiencies, and then one thing that's going to define the class. If you're putting too many things into a subclass, especially at 3rd level, you've designed a new class and you didn't have enough features for a full class. You're trying to shove it into a subclass, and that always turns out poorly. This isn't that. What it is they're introducing a new feature that is weird, and they have to keep defining aspects of it so people understand it. So I want to make sure I mention, yes, there are 4 different features at 3rd level. Most of them are just going, by the way, this is what that means. And the first one you get is Arcane Armor. You turn into Iron Man. You have special magic armor. You can turn a suit of armor you're wearing into arcane armor, provided you have smith tools in hand. If the armor normally has a strength requirement, you don't have a strength requirement for using it. It acts as a spellcasting focus for your artificer spells. It can't be removed against your will, and it also expands to cover your entire body. It replaces missing limbs, and you can doff or don the armor as an action. This is something that a lot of people don't recognize about armor is doffing and donning the armor takes
like
time.
10 minutes.
Yeah. Doffing armor is taking off your armor if you're not familiar with the term. And doffing your armor, if I remember correctly, it's either 1 or 5 minutes, which in combat, a single round is 6 seconds. So 1 minute is 10 rounds. That means to take off your armor, if it only takes a minute, takes you 10 rounds. The average combat in 5th edition ends after about 5 or 6 rounds. So you have spent literally the entire combat just taking your armor off. Putting armor on takes 10 minutes. You have spent multiple combats just putting your armor on. It's why getting ambushed at night can be really, really bad for the paladin who doesn't have time to put on his plate armor and has to go out in his skivvies with his sword.
Unless they sleep in their armor.
Which, there are rules for that. It causes exhaustion levels and things like that. These are things that a lot of people don't think about. And when you don't realize those are aspects of 5th edition, that last aspect of arcane armor can feel really pointless. It's like, who cares? You can doff or don it as an action. You can put your armor on in 6 seconds. That's super, super useful. That is 100%, the Iron Man 3 armor flying around, Tony Stark just jumps into it. That is 100% what that is. And that is a huge deal. And then the final thing is the armor model. And again, this is just kind of defining how your armor works. You have 2 different versions of the armor. You have the Infiltrator and the Guardian. The Guardian is a melee kind of focused. Your gauntlets count as simple melee weapons. You're a punching artificer. They do a d8 of thunder damage, and a creature hit by the gauntlet has disadvantage on attack rolls against targets other than you until the start of your next turn. This is effectively the marking mechanic from 4th edition. The Guardian is literally that. You go up, you punch people, and then they have to try and hit you. And because you have magical, heavy armor, you're probably pretty hard to hit.
So is that punch still based on strength, or is it augmented by the armor?
If I remember correctly, I have to look through this. Uh, each model includes a special weapon. When you attack with that weapon, you can add your intelligence modifier instead of
Okay.
strength or dexterity to the attack and damage rolls. So this is another thing that's kind of interesting. You actually can have an intelligence-based melee character, which again was a thing in 4th edition. 4th edition, you literally could have almost any, depending on your class you chose, you could have any one of your ability scores be the one that you actually used for your attack rolls. I think there were a few that actually used their constitution scores
Yeah.
for certain of the things, which doesn't exist in 5th edition. But this does give you a way to play a tank, literally a tank. You are heavily armored, and you don't have to invest heavily in your strength score. You don't have to invest heavily in your dex score to have that really good armor class. You literally can just go in with a super high intelligence and punch people,
You've outsmarted their muscles.
which is great. The other thing the Guardian can do is they have a defensive field. It's a bonus action. You get temporary hit points equal to your level in this class.
So minimum of 3.
Yeah, and then as you go higher, it just gets more and more. And you can use this action equal number times equal to your proficiency bonus. You get all of them back on a long rest. So again, the Guardian is designed to mess with the action economy by specifically forcing enemies to waste their attacks on you. They waste their attacks on you sometimes just because you have a higher armor class than most of the rest of your group, because you can infuse your armor, which makes it a higher armor class. You can wear heavy armor. There's a bunch of different things you can do to do that. And with defensive field, you can just give yourself temporary hit points, which gets rid of part of the damage of the attack. So they're literally wasting attacks against you. The Infiltrator is even more of a kind of interesting thing. First of all, you get a ranged weapon. You get repulsor beams. There's no other ways to say it. A gem-like note appears in one of your armored fists or on the chest. I mean, this is armor. This is Iron Man.
Got your arc reactor.
It's a simple ranged weapon. It's got a normal range of 90, long range of 30. It deals a d6 of lightning damage on a hit. Once on each of your turns, when you hit a creature with it, you can deal an extra d6 lightning damage to that to target. Because they are simple ranged weapons, it means that also can be used with something like Sharpshooter to do your additional 10 points of damage. Because your intelligence is what you're using for it, this turns into a very single attribute dependent class. You don't need a dexterity score. You can stay pretty far range. The second thing you get with the Infiltrator is powered steps. Your walking speed is increased by 5 feet. And you have advantage on dampening field is the last thing. You have advantage on dex stealth checks. And if the armor would normally impose disadvantage on the checks, the advantage and disadvantage cancel each other out as normal. So if you're wearing heavy armor, which would normally make it difficult to be stealthy, this gives you the ability to be stealthy. You're faster than most other characters, and you have a long range. 90 feet is a really long range. Really, the only time you're going to get into that range is with something like one of the bows or something like that. Most other kind of thrown range weapons or things are going to be much shorter. And the long range of 300 feet, I think only the longbow is going to give you a longer range at your max range. And if you take Sharpshooter, your your short range becomes your long range. So you can hit anything up to 300 feet away without issue. The Infiltrator gives you a much more, kind of staying back. Surprisingly enough, the Infiltrator can be viewed more as the damage dealing aspect of it, whereas the Guardian is much more the kind of physical tank. And the Artificer in general can fill a role of being kind of an off healing style character as well. You do get some healing spells. So depending on the model that you choose, you really have added a lot of customizability to it. The other thing that's interesting about it, you can change the armor's model whenever you finish a short or long rest. So just because you were a Guardian yesterday doesn't mean you have to be a Guardian today. It's again that kind of customizability built into the Artificer is, hey, I'm always going to have the thing that's going to be most useful to us. If you are fighting a bunch of flying creatures, maybe you don't want to use the Thunder Gauntlets and the Guardian, because you're going to just be sitting there going, nyah, nyah, nyah.
Yeah, you're punching air.
But in situations where there's a horde of, melee enemies, you're fighting a horde of goblins, go with a Guardian. Go in and punch whichever ones look the toughest, go up and punch them in the face and make sure that you're the only one they're looking at.
Yeah, you got that target-rich environment.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Moving forward, you get extra attack at 5th level. That's just how 5th edition works. If you're going to be an attack action-based class, you need the extra attack to keep up with action economy. That's just how it works. The interesting thing about Artificers in general is once you give them extra attack, again, because they have magic items, giving them extra attack also means if they are using... because you have Lightning Launcher or the Thunder Gauntlets doesn't mean that you always have to use those. They're a tool in your kit, but if you find a really cool sword, as long as you have proficiency in it, you can use that, and getting extra attack means your magic items, especially ones like Flame Tongue or Frostbrand blades, where they do additional damage every time you hit, getting an additional attack means you are not just getting extra damage, you are doubling the additional damage of the magic item. Right. So looking at things like that can definitely be useful.
Because a spellcaster can only cast one spell a turn unless they got the quick cast, right?
Mm-hmm.
So being able to have that extra attack with the magically augmented attack, that's real strong.
Mm-hmm. Their extra attack is such an intrinsic part of a 5th edition. Like any weapon-based class gets extra attack. Half the cleric subclasses get extra attack because they're designed to be a little bit more weapon-based than spellcasting weapon-based. People don't really think about it as that useful because they're like, oh, it's extra attack. That's just how it works. But when you really think about it, again, action economy, turning one action into 2 separate attacks, and you can move between attacks, you can attack different targets, especially when you're looking at something like the Thunder Gauntlets. Whenever you hit a creature with a Thunder Gauntlet, they have disadvantage on attack rolls against targets other than you. So getting extra attack means you can now, instead of marking 1 target, you can mark 2 targets. That is a huge difference, especially since, and this is something I learned in 4th edition. I played a Sword Mage, was the character I played the most. And Sword Mages had an interesting marking feature, depending on the subclass you chose, where when you would mark them, if they hit a creature other than you with an attack, you would get something you could do as a reaction. And the one that I chose was if they hit someone other than you, you could immediately teleport to them and get a free basic weapon attack against them. And so one of the things that the Sword Mage was built around, depending on which Sword Mage you were playing, was you would mark targets at a range. You would mark them, and then you would move away from them so that they couldn't actually attack you. And it would force them to do that, and then you would get an extra attack as you teleported over to them. And that was one of the methods that you could really get a lot out of your Sword Mage, was marking people that had no way that they could attack you. The same thing can be true of this Thunder Gauntlet marking style thing. You could punch someone and get as far away from them as possible, so either they have to make their attack with disadvantage on someone else, or they have to waste their action trying to get back to you. And it's another way that you can control the action economy. Yeah, it's nice for them to always attack you, but it's just as useful to hit them and make it so that if they do attack someone else, they have to take the disadvantage. There's 2 different ways to do this, and both are equally valid.
Yeah, I'm seeing a lot of similarities between 4th and 5th edition, and it's villainized as one of them is.
It's my favorite thing. I still love 4th edition. 4th edition, I think, is one of the most fun editions of D&D, just because 4th edition was a spectacle. Everything in 4th edition was big and explosive. The reason Acquisitions Incorporated started with 4th edition, first of all, was a marketing move. But the reason it got as popular as it was watching people play 4th edition is fun as hell. It is seriously just incredibly fun because everything they do. My favorite situation, the first live game that they did, they are fighting against a Hydra. That the audience had picked the Hydra as their enemy through voting through an app. So they picked it live during the game. The Hydra comes up, and Will Wheaton was playing Aothel, and he comes up and he uses one of his daily, which is I think called Pyramid of Light something. And so he describes this really awesome thing, and he hits him and does this, and he misses because he's Will Wheaton. And then Mike Krahulik's turn, who's playing Jim Darkmagic, one of my favorite characters ever. And he goes, so this evil demon thing had just thrown a fireball at him. And he goes, you call that fire? And he goes, and I look at the ground, and the ground rips open, and this giant magma hand reaches up at another one, and this huge magma beast climbs out of the ground and gets ready. And Scott Kurtz goes, what level are you? He goes, like, what ability is that? He goes, it's called Summon Magma Beast. It's a second level of ability for wizards. It's like, I've got, like, hit things with hammer, and you're summoning fucking magma beasts? What the? Yep. That was, because Scott was a fighter. And so he sat there and he's like, well, I don't have cool things. Fighters did get really cool things. Everybody got cool things in 4th edition. And that's what 4th edition was. But so many things from 4th edition show up in 5th edition, and people just completely ignore it. The advantage-disadvantage system is from the Avenger. The Avenger had their Oath of Enmity ability allowed them to basically, as long as they didn't have anyone else around them, they rolled with advantage. They didn't call it that before.
Right.
But that's where the advantage-disadvantage system. I've heard there was something similar to it in 3rd edition somewhere, but it was in a weird supplement that nobody ever used, and I have never actually seen the feature. Someone just mentioned, no, it's actually from 3rd edition. No, it's 4th edition. It's the Avenger. That was the defining ability of the Avenger. Things like marking is starting to show up again, and I'm really, really happy that marking is showing up because it was such a fun part of playing a defender. And we're seeing a lot more kind of interesting things like being able to use something other than strength or dexterity for your attack rolls was everywhere in 4th edition, and now it's showing up in 5th edition again. There were a lot of great things built into 4th edition, and another thing I didn't realize, 4th edition was not a failure, and people didn't hate it. It actually sold relatively well. It just didn't hit sales expectations. It still was the best-selling RPG on the market. Pathfinder didn't become the number 1 RPG on the market until they stopped publishing things for 4th edition, and they stopped being number 1 because they weren't selling.
There's a vacuum.
Things.
Yeah.
A lot of people think that somehow Pathfinder, the entire time 4th edition was a thing, Pathfinder was always more popular. It never was. So I mean, that is kind of the cool stuff. Moving up to 9th level, you get armor modifications. And this interacts with the infusion thing. Basically, your armor now count as separate items for the purpose of your infuse feature. You have the armor, the boots, the helmet, and the armor special weapon. Each one of those things counts as a different item. Each one of those things can have a different infusion added to them. And the maximum number of items you can infuse at once is increased by 2, but those extra items have to be part of your arcane armor. So this is, again, that idea of we introduced the armor previously. Now we're going to give you more cool stuff, and we're going to link it back to a defining feature. We're going to allow you to infuse other things, and that can turn really, really cool. Making the gauntlets into returning weapons. Now you have, ranged punches, things like that. There's a lot of things you can do. And again, when you're thinking about homebrewing for the Artificer, remember, if you're doing something with infusions, understand these infusions can be really, really, again, technically that means you can turn your boots into boots of flying. Because one of the infusions you can use is to recreate the boots of flying. You have to be a pretty high level to do that. But that means with armor modifications, you can make a flying suit of armor. So that's something that you have to make sure you're thinking about when you're doing your home brewing. Is okay. You really need to look at those infusions, and if you're going to make something that can be infused, understand players are going to use every single one of these infusions they can eventually. Right. So think about that, and remember the limitations can make them more creative. Giving them something special, but making it a cloak or something. Maybe that's your artificer thing. Well, cloaks are nowhere near. There are nowhere near as many magic cloaks as there are magic weapons.
Right.
So by just giving them a cloak instead of giving them a weapon that they can infuse, vastly changes how they're going to think about this. And there's a lot of really cool cloaks that exist in D&D that they could turn this magic cloak into. So yeah, just one example. Finally, the last thing at 15th level is called Perfected Armor, and it basically gives you just an additional cool thing. For the Guardian, when a huge or smaller creature you can see ends its turn within 30 feet of you, you can use your reaction to basically grip it over to you. They make a strength save against your spell save DC, and a fail save. You pull them over Scorpion style directly to you. If you pull the target within to a space within 5 feet of you, you can make a melee weapon attack against it as part of this reaction.
And if you do not say, get over here while doing that, you've failed.
Yeah, definitely. This is another thing that's limited by your proficiency bonus. So again, limitations are good. But again, the Guardian, we mentioned before, that one issue with a melee-based character is flying creatures, other things like that are going to cause problems for you. If you can't physically reach them, creatures that are on elevation of some sort, if they're on a balcony, you have to climb up there or something. With this, you don't really have that problem. You just pull them down, and that, again, creates other issues. If they try to move away, opportunity attacks. When you hit them, any attack that they make against someone else is going to be made with disadvantage. Like, there's so many different things that just forcing movement on another character can be. Another thing, and I think this one depends on how your DM rules something like the Thorns spell, but if you have someone and there are thorns in between you, every time they move, every 5 feet they move, they take a d4 of damage based on the level of the spell. So if they're on the other side of the thorns and you drag them through the thorns and then punch them in the face, that can be a really great kind of combo between you and the druid on your team. Is they put thorns down and then you just drag people through the thorns.
Batman and Poison Ivy make a good team.
Yeah, definitely. The Infiltrator, any creature that takes lightning damage from your lightning launcher glimmers with a magical light until the start of your next turn. They shed dim light in a 5-foot radius, has disadvantage on attack rolls against you. In addition, the next attack roll against it has advantage, and if the attack hits, the target takes an extra d6 of lightning damage. This is such a RNG manipulator, effectively. This is statistical manipulation, because you're able to effectively hit a creature and make them have disadvantage on attack rolls against you, which is nice. You are now more difficult to hit. And with the Infiltrator, again, you're not meant to be taking a bunch of hits. You're meant to be running around and just shooting people. Combine that with they now shed dim light in a 5-foot radius, which means things like invisibility and stuff like that aren't going to work, because even if they go invisible, they're still shining. You can still see them. And then the next attack roll against it has advantage. That's
by anybody.
Anyone. The very next attack roll against it has advantage. So, since you have extra attack, you could hit them once, and then your second attack would have advantage. Or you can hit 2 different targets, and when you coordinate with your team, there are certain classes that advantage just does better things for them. Rogues get their sneak attack when they have advantage, no matter what other things. They don't need another person next to it. Advantage is very useful for rogues. Barbarians are crit machines. When they crit, they smite, they do really, really powerful things. So, understanding which targets are going to be the most valuable to hit are going to be super, super useful with this thing. Again, going back to the homebrew idea, if you're giving your artificer something that again, the idea of shedding light, dim light in a 5-foot radius doesn't sound, that sounds like flavor. But when you think about, well, if they try to go invisible, they still glow. That is a huge, huge deal. So understand, even when you're adding flavor, think about how the flavor is going to affect. And you can use this thing to encourage certain play styles. We've talked about it in a couple other of the videos. By doing this thing where the next attack against it, and only the next attack, gets advantage, you're encouraging the player to target creatures where them having a target having advantage against an attack roll is going to get the most benefit. So it might be you target the creature with the highest armor class because the party is having a hard time hitting it. It might be that you target the one that has the highest hit points because you want to encourage your rogue or your paladin or some other kind of crit base. The barbarians are also huge crit machines. If they crit, they do tons and tons of damage, especially by level 15. You can actually encourage your party to basically attack the targets you want them to attack without having to have a metagame discussion. You just light up the target. You're like, I think that's the target. It means that the infiltrator version of the Armor-Artificer is going to be a little bit more that battlefield commander just because of that ability. And it's a really, really simple way to go, I want to create a character that feels like this.
Yeah.
And just by doing something like that, it's not massively broken. It's a single attack roll that you get advantage on, and it's a level 15 ability. So it's not like this is broken or anything, but just that little thing of I can give advantage to a single attack roll can massively change. And it makes the rest of the party understand. If the fighter goes up and you have, maybe the fighter's next and the rogue is after that, the fighter goes up and gets rid of that advantage and the rogue is not able to get their sneak attack because of it, well, then the party's going to go, maybe I shouldn't have done that. So this just as easily can be something to discourage someone from attacking this particular target because another person is going to get a much better benefit from the advantage than this other character. So this is, again, one of those abilities that really encourages teamwork. And I love things like that. Anything that can affect other players on your team, I think is really good.
Yeah.
So that's the Armorer. Joe, I've been talking a lot. You're kind of, what are your thoughts on the Armorer specifically?
It does feel a lot like the 4th edition field control.
Yeah.
And that was fun.
I love control.
It's and it is chock full of flavor. That balance between Iron Man and Batman. I'd have to look at the spell list to see what I would do with it, but it does sound like a lot of fun.
Yeah. So again, with the Artificer is the only new class that has officially been introduced by Wizards of the Coast. The Blood Hunter was designed by Matt Mercer, and because it showed up in the Explorer's Guide to Wildmount, it is officially published by Wizards of the Coast. It does exist. You can do it on D&D Beyond. But as far as new classes, since the original introduction of the 12, 13 base classes in the Player's Handbook, the Artificer is the only new one that Wizards of the Coast has introduced in 5th edition. And I think that says a lot just about how kind of robust the choices are in classes, because there's a lot of variety in 5th edition, and they haven't needed to add a bunch of new classes to get it. They've done it mostly through subclasses.
It fundamentally changes the feel of the game with the magic item commodity. Because if you make it a subclass of wizard, then it's
again, from a homebrew perspective, if you want to make a new class, and this is something that was really important when I made my custom class, the Dragon Knight, is you need to understand that thing that I see in every one of these videos, that quick refresher in 5th edition class design. You're defining features from level 1. This class should feel different.
Hmm.
than other classes that are like it. That was one of the problems with every edition other than 4th edition was at level 1, all weapon-based classes played the same.
Yeah.
All spellcasters played the same. 4th edition was the first edition that really changed that because the power system, right from level 1, you got to do interesting things that no other class could do.
Hmm.
And 5th edition took that idea and ran with it to where if you're creating a new class, your defining feature needs to be unique in some way. At level 1, you should feel differently
Yeah.
right when combat starts, when you're interacting with NPCs, whatever you're doing, you should feel different. You shouldn't feel like, oh, well, either me or the fighter can do the exact same thing, because that doesn't feel good. You feel kind of worthless. I've played in a couple games where they had 2 people of the same class, and it gets frustrating because you want to feel special, and yet you have someone that can do the exact same things that you can do, and it almost turns into a contest of who can volunteer to do it first, so they actually get to feel special this time. So if you are creating a new class like the Artificer, really, really focus on how am I going to do something that feels different than what already exists. Because if you're just going, you know what, I really wish, there was a, someone that could punch people, but wasn't kind of the crazy, like, Chinese, Japanese, kung fu, karate style martial artist of, I want a brawler. So I'm going to make a new class called the Brawler. That's going to be this, like the monk, but he's going to be strength based. That's not really, that goes against the idea of 5th edition class design. If the class already exists and you just want to make tweaks, that's a subclass. That's not a new class. A new class needs to be different. It needs to really feel different. The Blood Hunter is vastly different than anything in the game. You can't make a fighter that feels like a Blood Hunter no matter what feats and subclasses that you take. The Blood Hunter is just different. So that's a really important point is if you want to homebrew your own class, understand, pick out your defining features first, pick out something that's different. In the Final Fantasy XIV series I did, there's quite a few classes where like they would take effectively sneak attack from rogue and then also add in spellcasting or something and go, well, it's a new class because I took 2 different defining features put together. No, that doesn't work because the rogue is balanced around sneak attack. And if you put something and you don't have all the limitations of the rogue built into it, the limitations of multi-classing, it's not going to work. It's either going to be overpowered or underpowered.
A spellcasting rogue is it already exists.
Well, yeah, but it's a third caster. I can't even remember what it's called now. I feel dumb when because it was in the what is it? Arcane Trickster. There we go.
Yeah, there we go.
Arcane Trickster is a third caster. This is good. Well, I want a full spellcaster, but I also want them to have sneak attack. No. It creates a character that's not going to work in 5th edition. You can have technically a full caster and a rogue. You create a rogue that multi-classes into wizard. Wizard is a full caster. Rogue it has sneak attack. But if you try and put those together without the limitations of multi-classing, you create a broken class. Mm-hmm. So anyway, so that's what already exists. Again, I normally do what I call the PHB versions of everything, but this didn't exist in the PHB. The first version of the Artificer in Eberron had Alchemist, Armorer, Battlesmith, Alchemist, Artillerist, and Battlesmith, and then Armorer was introduced in Tasha's. So that's all the Artificers that currently exist. As a real-life Artificer, what are some ideas of Artificers that don't exist that you think are cool?
Let's see.
And
go
ahead.
So I've always loved biological based artificers.
Oh yeah.
You get yourself a Dr. Frankenstein or Bane or something like that where you're changing the fundamental, or Dr. Moreau.
Yeah.
So
Got to get that
flesh
Jules
crafting.
Verne in there.
Pardon?
Got to get that Jules Verne in there.
Yeah. having the ability to like fundamentally change a living thing, and it just also an artificer feels like it always should be able to dabble in everything else.
Mm-hmm. That
So
little bit of jack of all trades kind of a thing. You know,
yeah,
they're constantly trying to do different things.
yeah, because if you got an artificer dabbling in druid, you get that, or or necromancer.
Well,
You get
that's kind of the idea I got when you said kind of a fleshcrafters is a necromancer kind of based artificer, where instead of just making little magic devices, maybe even allowing them to use the healer's kit as their spellcasting focus, because they specifically do things like magic tattoos would probably be like the base level of, okay, well, this is the first thing I might
yeah.
dabble in, and then they just start with magical augmentation. I don't know.
Get yourself a shamase.
Yeah, I don't know if you've played Elden Ring at all. I would assume you're at
The
least
only thing that
familiar
I've
with
seen of
what it
Elden Ring
is.
is the like guy with a pot and underwear.
Yeah, that's there's a character, one of the bosses in there, called Godric the Grafted, and he decided, lore-wise, he decided that having extra limbs is always a benefit. And so he was a ruler of a kingdom, and what he did was he basically forced through kind of like through inscription, as in
Yep.
forcing you into the military. You would have to donate limbs to him that he would graft onto his body. And he is a terrifying kind of body horror boss. But the most interesting thing is halfway through the boss fight, when you get him to half health, he takes his massive great axe and he goes, ah, and he chops his own arm off, because there is the corpse of a dragon in the battlefield, and he rips off the dragon's head and grafts it to his arm. And the second half of the fight, he's shooting fire out of a dragon head that has replaced his arm. That idea turned in, like, that is kind of an artificer thing, using magic to kind of create things. Instead of creating clockwork things, you're creating things of flesh. So being able to modify yourself, modify other people. I like the idea of like the healer's kit is their spellcasting focus, because they're, you know, using, like, again, it starts getting into body horror, which for some people can not be a subject that they want to breach. So remember lines and veils, folks.
Yep.
But yeah, you know, that could be a really cool.
But I mean, even not doing the like the body horror, Dog Ock.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, anytime you're starting to talk about adding limbs and things like that. First of all, we spoke before we started recording about the D&D Direct that happened, and the new Thri-Kreen race, which isn't new; it's existed since second edition. But one of the things in previous editions was Thri-Kreens had multiple arms, so they could carry extra weapons, they could make extra attacks,
Yeah.
and how much that could massively break 5th edition D&D, because action economy is such a big deal. So if you are creating an artificer that's adding additional limbs or things like that, understand if you're going to be messing with action economy, you need to create some sort of limitations. Or if you want to give additional limbs, come up with something other than action economy that it affects.
Because I could see it like giving advantage and disadvantage.
Yep. That way, I mean, the monk has a subclass where they get a bunch of extra arms, and it increases their reach. So that's another thing that you can do. Reach is another thing that is vastly undervalued in 5th edition, except for the people that take the Polearm Master feat and the Sentinel feat, who are really, really annoying.
I've got a rogue that's all about like trying to make sure that I'm in and out.
We in the Adventurers League, which is where I cut my teeth DMing. That was the super OP in the first year of D&D, before people started getting creative. That was one of the super OP broken combos, which it wasn't, but it did get very boring very quickly. Because what it would was Polearm Master lets you, or I think it would. There was a feat that let you, instead of you got to take an opportunity attack when they entered your attack range instead of
Yep.
leaving it. So if you had a weapon with reach, they would enter your attack range, and then Sentinel, if you hit somebody with an opportunity attack, their speed immediately goes to 0.
Yep.
So what they would do is they would have something with reach, and they would stand in an area, and then anytime a creature came forward, they would bop it. And melee creatures, it was super, super useful because they wouldn't be able to get close enough to make any attacks. Now, it was limited to the reaction, so it wasn't nearly as broken as people thought.
It's Raphael in Soul Calibur.
Yeah, yeah!
You can't get
pokey,
near me.
pokey, pokey. I loved Raphael. He was super fun. He got super cool as they went in. Like, he turned into a vampire eventually. Like, he got massively badass in the later games. And then 6 rebooted everything. They took away his vampire stuff.
Huh.
Yeah. I play Soul Calibur for the story because I'm really, really shit at fighting games.
There was a point where I was playing Soul Calibur on the GameCube using the Donkey Konga drums. That's what I would use when I played Raphael because I could beat somebody while playing a song.
I love that. Yeah. So anyway, getting back to homebrew type
Right.
stuff. Yeah, reach can be an interesting thing. This whole idea of a biological artificer, I think, is just really, really cool. Back when Artificer was just an Unearthed Arcana class, that was massively different than what it is. One of the games, I created an NPC that was an Artificer for my players to interact, and the thing that I did, he was in he was a gladiator, gladiator slave in this place that the players got forced into. And so what he did was he had lost his arm in one of his gladiator combats. He used his artificer-ness to build himself a new arm that had multiple hand things. And that's how I kind of flavored all of his different spells. Is he would just go chunk, and he would put a nozzle, and he'd be able to spray acid off it, or chunk, and this one would have fire. And that's how he casted all his spells. Is he would load a cartridge in, and I thought it was a really cool flavor. The mechanics didn't change at all, but flavor-wise, I thought it was pretty cool. And I think that kind of an artificer could be really, really fun, and wouldn't even need to. Again, we always think the steampunk, adding more technology. The idea of a biological artificer could be really cool. It reminds me of I can't remember the name of the system. It's part of the Cipher system. It's I hate doing this in the middle, but my brain is not going to let me forget it until I look it up.
Yeah, no, that's fair.
Cipher. Numenera.
Yep.
Or no, The Strange is the one I was thinking about. The Strange. The Strange is basically a multiverse style system. And one of the 2 kind of parallel worlds you can go to is entirely, it's a science fiction setting, but their science went entirely into biological modification, things like that. And so it's an entire culture where they grow ships and they modify their body with technology, but it is all very, very, very much cyborgs and biological science and things like that. And it's a really, really cool, almost post-apocalyptic kind of setting, almost cyberpunk kind of the thing.
Yeah, get yourself some wetware.
Yeah, it's really, really cool. So yeah. So that's one idea. To me, artificers kind of exemplify what we think of. There's so many kind of modern superheroes that I think artificers kind of gel with. And as far as an artificer that doesn't currently exist, I think, and this is just because I am a huge Castlevania fan. I think the whip is a vastly underutilized weapon in 5th edition, and I constantly make characters that use whips just to annoy people.
Sure.
I think an artificer, kind of based on the idea of Spider-Man, where it is built around the idea of having something like a whip or something that they can use to manipulate people at range. They can tie people up with webs. They can swing people around. A very control-based artificer, because like you, I really loved controllers in 4th edition.
Yeah.
And it's one of the most underutilized aspects of 5th edition. You know, a really cool kind of artificer that is based around some sort of whip or some sort of chain style thing, and all of their things are about using ropes and other things to create a Spider-Man style character. I think it'd be really, really fun.
That could be fun.
I don't know how, like, mechanically that would be an interesting one to deal with. But again, that idea of increasing reach could be a lot of fun.
And changing the terrain, you get yourself some webs.
Yeah, modifying terrain, making them hypermobile with being able to maybe web slinger, things like that. Again, being able to grapple from range is a really big deal. Being able to move people from range, those are all things that can be, again, are generally undervalued, especially by, I call them the forum D&D, based on a conversation Chris Perkins had forever ago, where he was talking about how D&D is different than it was. In 3rd edition, the internet existed during 3rd edition. It's really weird. Before Facebook, the internet was a thing. And even going back as far as 2nd edition, the early 90s, the internet still existed there. And the way that you talked about things was through message boards, which eventually became forums. And specifically in 3rd edition, when you talked about D&D, you would give character builds. Oh yeah, this is my Fighter 3, Sorcerer 4, Paladin 2, and he has these things, and that's how you talked about D&D. Yeah. In 5th edition, we still have we have forums, we have Reddit, and we have Discord servers now, but they serve the same basic principle. And now when you talk about DA is, oh, I have this really cool dragon sorcerer that did this thing this one time where he was going in and he had this cool idea. You're not talking about how you built the character. You're talking about the story that the character made. And so the older version of players, the people that are, 3rd edition purists, Pathfinder players, are still going to be talking builds. These are my builds. And the newer generation of role players are going to go, these are the stories that I've told. Well, when you compare something in a build kind of mind, things like moving things around does not feel as powerful as I can do 60-10 damage. However, being able to manipulate the battlefield is significantly more useful than a damage dump. Because, and I mentioned this, somebody on one of the Reddit pages for the Reddit page for the Final Fantasy XIV compendium I covered, was talking about how the Gunbreaker was so underpowered because this class could just do so much more damage. I said, well, yeah, but the Gunbreaker has so many things that you can't do. The Gunbreaker has an ability where you can push them back without a save. You just hit them and they move back 5 feet. Kind of similar to
that's
how
huge.
Well, the monk, the open hand monk has kind of something similar. I think there's still a save involved in it.
I think there's still a save, but moving without a save?
Yeah, it's you have to make the attack, and I may be misremembering it, but I've seen other things like that give you the ability to move. They're like, who cares about 5 feet? I said 5 feet is huge, especially when you add an extra attack. That means
or a cliff.
Yeah, and that was the thing. Is like in a situation where you have a paladin, they said the paladin is just better than the Gunbreaker in every way, shape, or form. I said no, it's not. Paladin can't smite at range. Rules as written, it doesn't have the ability to, or rules as intended, it doesn't have the ability to smite at range. It's meant to be a melee class. So if you're dealing with a flying character, the paladin is literally useless. They cannot reach the target at all. And their most useful feature, their smiting, as far as damage dealing is concerned, is completely pointless. The Gunbreaker has a ranged attack with their gun. They can shoot this little shockwave. If there's a cliff, a paladin at most can do what I think a D8 or a D10 from their, maybe a D12 from their weapon, and then 5D8 from the highest level smiting, which is cool. But if you drop someone off a cliff, you can do terminal velocity is what, 200 feet, so that's 20 D6.
Yep.
That's That's it. Like there's no comparison. So yeah, the idea of additional movement or being able to move your enemies, save or not involved, is a huge deal. So again, if you were creating this Spider-Man version of the Artificer, and making them a very control-oriented class, there's a lot that you can do with that, and combining that with their infusions and things like that, and the other kind of weird things that they can do. I think you could come up with something unique and fun, but it would be
Being able to
weird.
move allies would be great.
Yeah, that's another thing. That was something that I used to really love about the Commander in
Yeah.
4th edition, which the Battlemaster Fighter is technically supposed to be kind of the 5th edition version of it.
Yeah.
And it fills a similar role, but it's not the same. And the Commander in 4th edition had things where they could move it. They could use their movement to move someone else.
Somebody else.
Or they could sacrifice their standard action to give someone else an attack. And so the best way to play a Warlord was to be literally in the back of the party, just going, okay, you go ahead and make your attack, or you go ahead and move over there.
You as an artificer, it's Oracle.
Oh, I didn't think about that. Yeah.
Yeah. Because if you had some way to communicate, then you'd be able to, flavor-wise, give them the actions. But mechanically,
Dude, you mentioned Oracle. You're familiar with Birds of Prey?
yep.
If you are unaware of some DC lore that has been retconned, which annoys the hell out of me, but Barbara Gordon, who is the original Batgirl, due to I can't remember which story, was it The Killing Joke that it happened in? She takes a bullet in the back and she becomes paralyzed from the waist down, which means it's really, really hard to be Batgirl when you can't walk. So she became a new character, or she took on a new moniker and called herself Oracle, and she became, the guy in the chair. And she was such an interesting, unique character that worked with the Birds of Prey, which were two other. It was a sub Batman superhero group of women. They had a movie that came out and it was real bad.
Had a show, also not great.
Yeah, the show was better than the movie. But the idea of having that person in the chair, a lot of people would think, okay, that's not really how I would want to play D&D. But again, looking at how much fun the Warlord was in 4th edition, it was so much fun to play. Having a guy in the chair kind of thing, and you wouldn't literally need to be in a chair, but being the person that kind of stays back and kind of directs things is a super, super fun role to play in a tabletop game. And it sounds counterintuitive, but it's not. So I would love to see a guy in the chair Artificer. Like, the Artificer would fit perfectly with that, because they could equip their allies before the battle starts, and then when battle's going on, they're looking at their maps and their readouts and stuff and telling which people to go where, and everyone else is doing the cool stuff. They would be the Professor X. They would be the Oracle.
Q. They would essentially be, they're outfitting their folks because they've studied the situation.
Yeah. I mean, and again, it's another thing, and this is actually a conversation I had with a buddy of mine in the Adventurers League. Is we talked about he would build these really, really crazy, awesome characters, because he was super, super knowledgeable of a 5th edition, and he was a great role player too. So he was you could technically call him a min-maxer because all of his characters were optimized, but he did not min-max. He had in-character reasons for every single choice that he made. He just made good characters. And I was talking with him, and he said, well, I'm going to do this and this and this and this. I said, and in 5th edition especially, I'm not a huge fan of multi-classing because I like sticking with a single class and getting the higher level abilities and things. I think that's really fun, and the higher level abilities are super cool. Yeah. And as much as I've heard a lot of people argue, well, multi-classing is super broken and it breaks 5th edition. Not in any way, shape, or form. Multi-classing actually makes you weaker than a lot of your allies because you get spells later. You get You get ability score improvements later. You may get less ability score improvements depending on which levels you take, because if you never get up to level 4, if you only take 3 levels of a class, you are missing out on ability score improvement, at least one, which can turn into a feat. I mentioned him. I was like, you make these really cool characters, but they are solo characters. He's like, well, yeah, I guess you're right. And I guess the reason I did to do that is the Adventures League, we never know. In the convention circuit, you never know who you're going to play with. You literally sit down at a table with a bunch of strangers, and by the end, you're super good buddies. I met some of my closest friends in Wisconsin through the Adventures League. But you never know what the party makeup's going to be, and there's always a chance you're going to get either a new player or a dick. And in the Adventures League, your character dies. Congratulations. If you don't have enough money to resurrect them, you just lost 3 years of playtime that you've invested in this gig of characters. So he would make these characters that could solo and could keep themselves alive. And it worked well, but I see a lot of people with that mindset of, I have to make my character so that anything that I want to do, I don't have to rely on anyone else. And you can make characters like that, and they work perfectly fine. Don't get me wrong. But it is so much more fun to create a character that relies so much on the other team, the rest of your team. And that those combinations of abilities and things like that. Like I ran for a family that plays together. The father used to DM for me. I used to help run a convention. And so I had a list. I still have the list somewhere, but I had a list of DMs that every time, it was about 4 or 5 months before the convention was going to be, it'd be like, hey guys, these are the games you're running. I need you guys to sign up. And he was one of the guys that used to run, like 4 or 5 games a weekend for me. And he would bring his family to all these conventions, and they played together. They had a party, like him and his wife and his 2 daughters. They had a party that played all of the adventures together. And they sat down at my table, and we were running some tier 3 content, which in the Adventures League, there's not a ton of tier 3 content, and it gets rough. And it's supposed to be. They're really, really fun to play, but you need to know your characters. They didn't just beat this encounter, they trivialized it. They weren't min-maxed. They didn't have broken items, or, they weren't, I learned the rules really, really well so that people that tried to abuse certain rulings and things like that, they couldn't get past me. My favorite one to deal with were, I called them the Peekaboo Rogues. They'd make Halfling Rogues, and one of the things, Halflings, one of the subclasses, I think the Lightfoot Halfling, they can actually try to hide against a creature that's medium or larger. So what they would do is they'd have a friend go right up to an enemy, and they would stand right behind them. They'd use their cunning action to hide, and then they'd use that to get advantage on their attack roll, and they never rolled with disadvantage. And they go, well, that's how it works. That's how all the mechanics. I go, no, it doesn't. And I'd let them do that once, and then they go, okay, I roll with advantage. I said, no, you don't. But I rolled my stealth check. Yeah. And I rolled like a 27. Yeah, are you telling me that their passive perception is higher than 27? Nope. Well, then I get advantage because they can't see me. Nope. That's against the rules. You're not allowed to break the rules. I said, no, it's not. And I would read them. If an enemy can't see you and is not expecting an attack, you get advantage. Mm-hmm. Do you really think they literally just saw you walk up behind this guy? They can't see you real well. But do you really think they don't think you exist anymore?
Well, it's fine as so long as you're fighting against things that have no object permanence.
Well, that's what I would say. I say 2-year-olds have object permanence. They've done studies right around the 2-year mark is when object permanence becomes a thing. That's why Peekaboo is such an amazing thing for babies, because before that point, you don't exist as soon as your face disappears. You literally have vanished into the cosmos and you've become an object. Once the face appears again, you exist.
It's a terrifying game. Like thinking about it rationally, like I put my hands here, I cease to exist. Where?
So yeah, and they were I said, I'm quoting rules at you. You are a rogue. You are this close to broken without this rule. You have so many different ways to get your sneak attack. You have so many different ways to get advantage. You don't need advantage on every single attack roll. I'm sorry if you feel that is your right, but that's how it is. And so this group didn't do any of that. They just knew. They had played together for years, these same characters. They would go to conventions and play together, and they completely trivialized the thing. The adventures, they had to go into Sithmore Cain, which is a drow city in the Underdark that had been taken over by fire giants in this storyline, and they had to capture a fire giant and bring it back to a mind flayer, because dealing with mind flayers is always a good thing. The mind flayers who hired them. It was a cool adventure. I loved it. But capturing a fire giant is hard, especially since these fire giants are really high challenge rating things, and it is in an entire city of fire giants. So they had to be super... Didn't bat an eye. They went in, they used Wall of Force and I think Moonbeam to trap him in one location and just boiled him with a beam of moonlight. And there's nothing he could do because they just went, this, and I'm like, wow. That is insane. And then they just polymorphed his unconscious body to bring them... it was brilliant. And so, yeah, they could have made super broken classes.
Sure.
But they just knew their playstyles. Every other character knew... every other player knew what the other players could and couldn't do. And they had specifically built their party to work together. And it was the most overpowered thing I've ever seen in my life. In 4th edition, the joke that we used to tell is the most broken thing in 4th edition is teamwork.
Yeah.
None of the classes were really that broken. Everything was crazy. But when you started working together with other people, you could trivialize any encounter. You could take down a Jurassic if you wanted to. And yeah, building subclasses that rely on teamwork feel super underpowered when you talk about them until you get into the game. And you make that clutch move of, hey, Barbarian, go attack with advantage. Crit 7d12 damage. You're welcome. Like, there's nothing better than just sitting back going, you're welcome. Like, it's super, super fun.
It feels good. And it, like, on the one hand, removing the player agency of the people you're manipulating, not as cool. But if you're working as a team, you're talking about it anyway.
Well, and again, there's a difference between forcing someone to do something or giving them the option to do it. You know, again, that idea of choice over right answer. You know, good design versus bad design. If you want to build a homebrew artificer that is that guy in the chair kind of thing, understand if you make it, I can mind control my allies to force them to do things, that's not going to feel very good.
No, that's what 4th edition felt like to me.
I can totally see that.
Yeah. But see, like giving, it's like, okay, I'm going to sacrifice your move. You here have the extra move, and they do with it what they want.
Yeah. Again, giving a player a choice of here, you can use my movement speed, or you can use my action to do something. That's going to be a lot more fun. It's going to feel a lot better. Mechanically, it generally is going to give the same effect.
Yeah.
Because again, when you played a Warlord in 4th edition, you weren't generally taking player characters from other people and making them do things that they didn't want to do. Like, that didn't last very long. If that's how you were playing your Warlord, you weren't going to stay in that group very long. You all already knew what they were going to do, and there was a mutual agreement. So mechanically, the same effects happened, but it feels a lot better if you give them the choice. And there's always the chance that I'm going to give you my action to do something, and this is what I want you to do with it. They go, well, that's a good idea. Thank you, phone. Secret of Mana. But there's also the chance that they'll go, okay, I'm going to give you my action to do this. And they go, that's a great idea, but I have this other ability that will work better. Oh! I've had that happen quite a few times where it's been, hey, if I do this, then you can do this. And they go, yeah, but I could also do this. Oh, I totally forgot that was something your character could do. Yeah, do that. That's better. I'll still do my the thing. So yeah. Well, we've been talking for over an hour and a half. Let's go to final thoughts. Again, going back to the Artificer, which is where we started. The Artificer is the first official new class for 5th edition that Wizards of the Coast released. And at its very core is unique. It casts spells differently than any other class. It makes you think differently. It is tied to magic items intrinsically. So when you are homebrewing, understand your class, your subclass should make the character think differently. And should take into account that the character should already be thinking kind of did it differently, because that's how the Artificer works. Also, never undervalue the idea of incentivizing certain things to make the subclass play the way you envision it. Limiting them by saying you can't do this, you can't do that, can be a way to kind of guide them in the right direction. It's generally not as much fun if you incentivize. It doesn't feel good. Yeah.
Characters.
Definitely. So incentivize the things like the Infiltrator ability, where it gives advantage on that incentivizes certain things, and understand when you are doing things like giving advantage or inducing status conditions and things like that. Understand that that's going to guide how they play the class and act to it accordingly. Joe, your thoughts, your final thoughts.
Let's see from my notes here. I'm being always prepared. 4th edition is not as bad as everybody says. Don't break a defining feature. Yeah. Player agency. And customization. Customization is a lot of fun.
So, if people want to see other stuff or otherwise just kind of stalk you on the interwebs, is there a place where they can, find different stuff that you did do? Like, do you have like a Twitter that you use, or do you have Instagram?
I have gone into hiding since I became a parent.
Aha! Very much understand that.
I ran a tabletop podcast called Liquid Tabletop, which I believe is still out there. The last episode was the announcement of us having a kid, and I have not had a chance to go back to it.
Still, podcasts, super, super cool. What kind of stuff did you guys to talk about?
It was a live play.
Oh, cool.
Yeah. So I toyed with inserting other games elements into 5th edition. And it was, the idea behind it was the old Liquid Television on MTV, where it was just like a hodgepodge of short cartoons. And that's what it was. And so it was a series of interconnected one-shots.
Very cool.
With a rotating cast. If you look at the very old Wizards of the Coast Extra Life games, you'll be able to see some of my work. I was one of the DMs in the season of Giants.
Very cool.
And the Fire Giants were mine, and I did a anachronistic office building of research and development for the Cloud Giants. We were building their gear.
Ha! Cool.
Yeah. So always an artificer.
So for this Liquid, so my memory is absolutely horrible. What was the podcast called again?
Liquid Tabletop.
Liquid Tabletop.
What? And it was on all of the things.
So like Podbeam and
Podbeam, Spotify, it's on Apple Podcasts.
I will, as long as I can find, I will try to have a link in the description so you can check out that stuff at least, because that sounds super, super cool. I'm a huge fan of that anthology style
Yeah,
weird
Kiri
stuff.
was a character and a player. We had one player play Kiri, and Kiri played another character.
But by the way, if you were not aware of the Kiri we referred to, Kiri Callaghan, a friend of ours, she's an author. She's everything. She's the coolest person I've ever met. She plays in my Realms of the Wild Zelda RPG every other Saturday. And she's actually how we got introduced. So that's the Kiri we're talking about. She also sings. And she has so many cool things. Her book is on. That's Alice, the Terra Mirum Chronicles. That's her first book. Changeling is actually next to my bed because I have to finish reading it. She's a brilliant author. She's got a new deal on a new fiction series that she's going to be starting sometime.
Sapphic Detective.
Yeah, kind of a lady version of Sherlock Holmes with some sapphic undertones, and it's going to be super. You got to read Kiri's stuff. She's probably one of the coolest authors I've ever read, and she's kind enough to play games with me. So I always like that. Anyway, so yeah, that's the Kiri we're mentioning.
Yeah, I'm also working on being able to doing weddings because I do a lot of nerdy weddings. I have run D&D as a wedding event.
That would be.
There's nothing like having 200 players.
Wow, that is a combination wet dream nightmare.
It was
for a DM.
That is exactly it. I converted the courtship into a module, and we played it during the reception.
That would be a very special wedding gift, definitely. Anyway, so yeah, he done some cool stuff. Maybe not as much as you are raising the next generation of D&D and RPG players. But definitely to check that stuff out. Otherwise, that is going to be all for me today. As always, again, like, subscribe, turn notifications on in the comments down below. What is your favorite idea of an Artificer style character? Are you a big fan of the kind of superhero genre like Batman's and Spider-Man's and the things like that? Are you more into the more like Hephaestus, mythology style things? Do you like the steampunk version? Would you prefer solar punk? Do you like the biological Artificer? Let me know in the comments down below. Otherwise, again, that is all for me today, and I will see you guys next time. All right? Bye-bye.